Nestled in the heart of the southern Appalachian Valley, northwest of Knoxville, Tennessee, Brushy Mountain State Prison would be built in 1896 as a new system of incarceration. It was built in Petros, a small town inside Morgan County, Tennessee. After the Civil War, the process of Reconstruction began. While a decent enough plan by the government, the South was never given the boots on the ground required to acclimate freed blacks into a white-dominated society. This led to the creation of black codes and the unofficial start of mass incarceration in the United States. Freed slaves were rounded up by white bounty hunters, who would eventually become the police we have today, for petty crimes that never warranted jail time. They were then brought to penitentiaries across the South. Of course, the motivation for this new penal system was pure fear. Whites feared that blacks would be integrated into their communities, and that was something they would not dare allow. So blacks were arrested en masse, and they were sentenced to hard labor in these new prison stockades. One aspect of this new system was that private companies were allowed to lease prisoners to work for them. This was state-sponsored slavery. This new slavery would have freed slaves falsely arrested, then forced to work for private companies building railroads, mining coal, and working in the fields. Even though this happened to white prisoners as well, the number of blacks in prison significantly outweighed whites, as they continue to do today. Some might conclude that we still practice state-sponsored slavery today. Sometimes, private companies would even lease the entire prison to work on their projects. As the railroad boom fizzled out, the next big project became coal mining. Oddly enough, this new prison system not only hurt prisoners, but hard-working unionized coal miners as well. The cheap labor influx from the prisons clashed with the union workers who were now unemployed due to the leasing system that allowed such terrible behavior. Thus, the Coal Creek War was started as a way to destroy the local prison system so the union workers could get back to their jobs. The war ended up leading to a change in the law in 1893. The Penitentiary Act ended the leasing of convicts, but would not go into effect until 1896. Another piece of the legislation was the establishment of two new state prisons, the Tennessee State Prison and Brushy Mountain State Prison. As governments tend to do, the state of Tennessee searched for a way to get around this newly established law, and they found the perfect way to do so. During the planning of these new prisons, they had the insidious idea of purchasing coal fields that could double as a prison and a mine operation worked by inmates. For 9,000 acres of coal fields, the state paid $80,000 and built Brushy Mountain State Prison on the land. Of the two new prisons built out of the Penitentiary Act of 1893, Brushy Mountain Prison was meant to house incarcerated mine workers and nothing more. All of the structures that combined to form the prison were made from wood and labeled as comfortable and safe. The main building spotted 4 stories, with 3 of the stories composed of barracks and guard rooms. Each section of sleeping quarters was divided by race and held about 100 prisoners. Other than the main building, there was the rear wing, the hospital, an office building, a kitchen, and some barns scattered across the property. In addition to the main gate, there was one passageway outside the perimeter walls known as the manway. It served as the entrance to the mines for the prisoners. At the turn of the 20th century, Brushy Mountain quickly became the guinea pig for any new reformations politicians puffed their chests out for. Specifically, politicians at the time thought that every prisoner should produce enough to counterbalance the tax dollars spent on them. State politicians went so far as to claim that northern-style prisons that simply housed prisoners and didn't force them to work were useless. These new ideas led to major changes inside Brushy Mountain, as they filled as much space inside the prison as they could with factories with prisoners working on such products as soap, tobacco, furniture, and meat processing. As you might infer, there was virtually no difference from the previous prisoner lease system to the newer in-house system of work, as the majority of the factories and products were owned and sold by private companies contracting with the government to take advantage of slave labor. Disgustingly, this practice is still common today. By 1917, Brushy Mountain prisoners worked in 7 different mines and produced upwards of $2 million for the state. Over the years, slavery continued, even though multiple riots left prisoners dead. In 1966, coal mining at Brushy Mountain finally stopped. Between low coal supplies, inmate riots, and dangerous conditions in the mines, the state decided to move on. Brushy Mountain became a maximum security prison in 1969. All low-level offenders were transferred out. By the year 1972, conditions had become so bad that even the guards were having problems. They ended up striking that year, leading to Governor Dunn closing the prison. What the governor failed to realize, however, was the massive impact the prison had on the local population. It was distinctively tied to both the local economy and state politics. With the prison being the largest employer in the county, jobs were extremely hard to come by and led to widespread protesting at the state capitol. The prison reopened in 1975 on the heels of a governor's race where Brushy Mountain became a decisive issue. Locals were ecstatic upon hearing of the reopening of Brushy Mountain, but they may have ended up regretting that decision as the prison would become a pop culture icon in its final decades. James Earl Ray, the man convicted of assassinating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968, would become the most infamous of prisoners incarcerated at Brushy Mountain. After years of appeals to the court, Ray would eventually be transferred to Brushy Mountain to serve out his 99-year sentence for his terrible crime. Less than a year after being sent to Brushy Mountain, he would attempt an escape. In 1971, Ray tried to escape via an air vent, but was quickly stifled as the air vent heated up to over 400 degrees Fahrenheit, causing him to retreat. Then, in 1972, he tried and failed again. This time, he tried to cut a hole in the ceiling of the gym, but never made any progress. Never deterred, Ray tried to escape again in 1977, but this time, he got outside the prison walls. Aided by a fellow inmate's distraction, Ray and a handful of other inmates, some he planned for, others simply taking advantage of the situation, made a run for the walls. They used ladders made from leftover plumbing bits to jump over the electrified fence. As was customary, the prison sounded the alarm, a whistle blown 6 times to communicate the escape of 6 inmates. The entire town woke up from the sound and was terrified. Once an inmate successfully leapt over the walls of Brushy Mountain, he was now entering a dangerous area full of steep terrain that only locals with experience could have navigated. Ray's fellow escapees were caught with relative ease, but Ray churned on. Helicopters, 150 armed men, and bloodhounds all converged on the tough terrain outside the prison to find Ray. Locals claimed to have spotted him every so often in an area that was supposedly already searched. This led to law agencies on the scene getting creative, so they called in the big guns, and by big guns I mean the locals. They found 2 local hunters who had lived near this land their whole lives and their family for generations. If anyone could find Ray, it would be them. After more than 2 days, Ray was discovered cowering under a pile of leaves when they found him. The escape of James Earl Ray went on to become a legend. Brushy Mountain would then be enshrined in pop culture forever. Ray died in 1998, and it seemed that Brushy Mountain would also die with him. A decade later, in 2009, Brushy Mountain would be combined with other Morgan County facilities and eventually closed years later. The legend of James Earl Ray's escape would never die. It would be reborn only 9 years later in 1986 with the inception of the Barkley Marathons. Gary Cantrell and Carl Henn would come up with the idea of the race after reminiscing on Ray's escape. During his escape, Ray covered about 12 miles in 55 hours as he hid from aerial searches from time to time. Cantrell scoffed at Ray's attempt and claimed he could do 100 miles in some of the toughest terrain you will find. The first race was run in 1986, with the length of the course being 55 miles with 27,000 feet of elevation climb. In 1988, the course was finished for the first time. The next year, in 1989, they extended the course to 100 miles with a time limit of 60 hours. It took 6 years until the course was first finished, as marathoners from around the world attempted the feat. Mark Williams finished the race with only 30 minutes remaining. Over the years, the Barkley Marathons have become steeped in pop culture after a recent documentary let the world in on the secret. Most years no one finishes, but that doesn't stop them from attempting to conquer the course. Every year the course is different, and there is no map of it to consult. You must follow signs and clues that take you all over the area, including Brushy Mountain State Prison, as you trek the grueling elevation climbs. The race is not for the weak, but it is tied to this unique piece of culture. Today, Brushy Mountain serves as a dark tourism location complete with a distillery, a restaurant, historical tours, and even a paranormal tour. Concerts and other events are welcomed as the former state prison continues to boost the local economy. Brushy Mountain was more than a prison. It was a symbol of the evolving system of incarceration. The prison had a unique effect on those that worked there, were incarcerated there, and lived through the times it was active. For such a regrettable relic of the past, Brushy Mountain can now be used to teach rather than enslave, to understand rather than to give judgment.